Good afternoon if you are in New York or Buenos Aires. Good evening if you are in Antwerp or somewhere on the European or African continents. Hello and special love as always to our loved ones in Ukraine. Stay strong. We think of you. We send you our strength. Greetings to people all around the world. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. As you well know by now, Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all over the world. I have been looking forward to this particular program for quite a while. It regards a company that I love and admire very much, but I've not had the chance to feature yet on my program, although I did have its former head on the show a few months ago when he was in Geneva, and now he's heading to Berlin, but more about that later. It is what I used to call the Flemish National Opera, but the proper title really should be the Opera Ballet Vlaanderen. And my pronunciation of Flemish is almost non-existent, so I will ask my guest today to correct me so that we always know that things are said as they're supposed to be said. We have Alejo Pérez, whose name is not originally a Flemish name. He is the chief conductor, artistic advisor, or director. I got to check with him. He's originally from Buenos Aires, Argentina. Welcome. We have
Thank you, Fred.
Daniel Vernooy. Daniel Vernooy joins us from somewhere in Flanders. Are you in Antwerp? Where are you?
I'm in Ghent.
You're in Ghent. Okay, very
Antwerp.
good. And look at this
Good here.
magnificent workshop behind you. Ghent is a gorgeous city. We have Gunther Cogen joining us from where?
I'm living in between Ghent and Antwerp in a small
Okay.
village in Temse, a very
Okay,
small
so-
village near the river, the Schelde, and it's just in between Ghent and Antwerp.
Beautiful. So we have one of each so far. And Wilfried, and how do I pronounce your last name correctly?
Eetezonne.
Eetezonne.
Well, that's very
Who-
good, Fred. Very good.
Is the person I've known the longest in this company. And you, where do we find you at the moment? It looks like you're on a ship.
I know. I'm in the office in the opera in Antwerp, where we just started a performance of Le Nozze di Figaro.
Very good. So I think in identifying where you fellows are begins to tell the story of the, what I still by reflex call the Flemish National Opera, Opera Ballet Vlaanderen, in that, let's go back to a little Belgian history. Belgium historically is composed of a French-speaking part and a Flemish-speaking part. A revolution in 1830 at an opera house in Brussels, we can get into that, led to the formation of the Kingdom of Belgium as we know it now. And historically, there are two very distinct cultural zones in this small but culturally rich and gastronomically fantastic country, namely Belgium. And so, but within this context, there are various Flemish cities that are historic and beautiful. And I would say in the case of Antwerp, a very famous seaport, a very famous trading center. It has a significant Jewish population, famous for the diamond trade. It's a fascinating city unto itself, famous for fashion. I know many people from Italy who have gone to Antwerp to study fashion design. So it's a trend-setting city. Ghent is one of the most gorgeous cities you can ever see. It is a bit invaded by tourists, but not too much. It is genuinely charming, which is an overused word. Wherever one goes in Flanders, which is to say the northern part of Belgium from sort of Brussels north to the North Sea, one finds a very intense culture. Correct me again if I'm wrong, Flanders used to be part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands and separated because there were religious and cultural differences. Wilfried, am I wrong?
Well, it's the whole of Belgium that used to be part of
The Netherlands.
Of the Netherlands, and
Okay.
and famously, the Belgian Revolution started with an opera performance in Brussels, with a performance of La Mouette de Portichy, where you have this famous aria, patriotic aria, and
Amour sacré de la patrie.
yeah, and the legend goes, it's a legend that the audience stormed out of the opera house and started the revolution, which led to the independence of Belgium.
I will take that story anytime, whether it's Milan in Italy or Brussels, where an opera company starts a revolution. I'm there for it. So any one of you, yes, go ahead, Wilfried.
Actually, yesterday or the day before, the King of Holland was on a state visit in Brussels, and he said, "Let's not go to the opera this time." So it still resonates.
Well, please talk to me about the fact, all of you, that this is a small country, a mostly flat country. We don't think of skiing in Belgium. It's a seafaring country. It's a country that has produced remarkable visual arts, tapestries. It has been culturally in the vanguard for many centuries. It has one of the best musical instrument museums I know anywhere in Brussels. How did the small country, sandwiched around the Netherlands, around Germany, France, and little Luxembourg, one that's bilingual, one that happens to have in Brussels, the capital of Europe, create this very particular identity that is both traditional, if one can use that word, but also very trend-setting and very eager to do something new and different and revolutionary in terms of the arts, when maybe other countries around them don't do it so quickly. And I'm adding filmmaking to that as well. It has a very famous film industry. Who wants to reply?
Are you asking someone in particular?
Any of you who live in Belgium?
Yeah,
in Flanders in this case.
Well, I think what we are a very creative country, and in all sorts of creative industries. You've mentioned fashion, you've mentioned movies, you've mentioned the visual arts, which is, of course, we have this very rich history of the Baroque painters, going from Rubens to Van Dyck, and even earlier with the Flemish primitives. I mean, in Belgium, there's a very, very strong creative side on part of the visual arts, I should say, going from Flemish primitives to comic books. I mean, like Tintin and so on and so on. I think, and this resonates in other art forms as well, like music, like certainly like movie making and the theater as well. We've always been, I think, Belgium let me say Flemish artists never felt the weight of history. In Flanders, we don't have a Shakespeare, for instance. We don't have a Molière, for instance. We don't have Cervantes, for instance. I'm not saying that we didn't have important artists in the past, but we don't feel the weight of retelling their stories and remaking their stories, which very quickly Belgium had a very keen sense for the avant-garde and for making art in a more progressive way than, let's say, in wonderful countries or wonderful cities like London, where you can watch wonderful Shakespeare, or in Paris, where you can watch wonderful Molière performances, but we don't have that repertoire in Flemish language, let's say, which gives us more space to experiment. And that sense of experimentation, also in movie making, also in fashion, also in every sense of the creative industry, has kept us going forward and forward and forward, and discovering new angles to bring art to people. And our audiences, and certainly for our company, are very adventurous, and they like to discover new ways of creating theater or creating opera or creating ballet. And I think that's a very important fact why the rest of the world looks at this very tiny country in Europe. I mean, if I think of all the choreographers we have produced in the 20th century, like Béjar, to Anna Teresa de Keersmaker, Wim van der Keyben, Sidelar Cherkaoui, he's now all over the world. Directors like Ivo van Hove, who are now all over the world. They've all started in this environment that allowed them to go beyond boundaries. Mm-hmm. And that is something that we're still doing today.
For any of you, is this question, do you think that sense of adventurousness is found in the cuisine, the magnificent cuisine of Belgium, or do they adhere more to traditional practices and ways of cooking things that have been done for hundreds of years?
Well, I know you're a great fan of gastronomy, Fred.
Yes.
So am I. I'm afraid it shows. More with me than with you, I must say.
I lost a lot recently.
But no, I should say that also in the Belgian cuisine, of course, you have the classical state, the classical brasseries and so on and so on. Yeah. But also in terms of gastronomy, we've seen some very adventurous restaurants who will take those classical recipes and again start experimenting with them. And this week, the 50 best restaurants of the world were announced. I'm sure you've visited many of them, and I believe and Belgium did very well in that ranking. Mm-hmm. We're at least in the top 50.
Sure. No, I asked that because not so only for gastronomic reasons, but also because one of the most adorable experiences I've ever had was at the Opera House in Ghent, where I was sitting watching an excellent performance years ago of La Forza del Destino, and I was in a box, and in the next box was a lovely family that arrived with sort of a basket, and they opened the basket, and during the performance, they were eating all kinds of delicious foods and passing food to me. And toward the end of the opera, during Pace Pace and the male duet, they brought out chocolates and started handing me chocolates. And apparently that's okay, at least to this family. But it was kind of like being at a football match or something where you ate as part of the experience of watching the opera, and they made no noise, and they're very clean and careful. They had cloth napkins and they had drinks, but they didn't make any noise. They were very quiet. You would never have known. But their experience of watching La Forza del Destino, which by the way has a big eating scene in it, was connected to the food. It was a matinee on a Sunday, and I've never experienced that anywhere else. I've been in Munich, for example. You can eat in the anterooms at the intermissions, the intervals, but never have I sat and enjoyed a meal while watching an opera in modern times. And that, it was very cozy. It was very charming. It was not excessive. It was not pretentious. It just seemed to be the most natural thing. So I'm bringing all of this up because I want our listeners around the world to understand that though opera is an international art form, there are places in our art form that still are very distinct and have their own characteristics. And Alejo, you're being from the Teatro Colón environment of Buenos Aires. a theater I worked in a couple of times in 2008 and 2016. And I'm sorry, and when I left the Met, so 1988 was my very first time there. And it's a magnificent theater, and Buenos Aires has a very different environment. The population of Buenos Aires, I think, is bigger than the population of Belgium. And
Yeah, I would say
it's
so.
a gorgeous theater that, because it's so far from practically everything, produces everything itself in terms of scenery and costumes and the fantastic, I've never seen leather in the boot shops like what you see in the Teatro Colón. You go under the main street, the Cinco de Julio, Nueve de Julio, I forget, Nueve de Julio. And there's a whole world underneath the biggest thoroughfare in Buenos Aires that is all shops relating to the gorgeous Teatro Colón that opened in 1908. As someone who had that formation for his musical and operatic life, you have had a very long, distinguished career in Europe. What did you and do you bring from that culture of opera in Argentina to the working life in a very different, much more experimental environment in Belgium?
Well, probably the feature that all Argentinians have in common is that we are normally trained for piloting in storm situation. That's our common state. We are jumping just from crisis to crisis. And by chance, it happened that I started my contract in Vlaanderen only half a season before COVID started. So in a way, this kind of flexibility and speed of adaptation that we normally have, because it's just a survival instinct. I'm not talking that I'm an extra nothing because of owning that. You are just forced to have that because that's your normal day to day. Made it for me kind of normal to just adapt and reprogram and whatever the situation was possible at particular times in terms of live streaming or just rehearsing with distances and so on. And as you know, as if it was everywhere like that, reprogramming like 10, 15 times the same title, but in different settings and so on. That made my earlier period in Antwerpen particularly easy, let's say, despite COVID. But I have to say, the audience, both in Antwerpen and in Ghent, are very warm, very open-minded, very eager to whatever adventure you propose, both musically and stage-wise. And what you have said is it's quite a distinct identity that the company has, this tendency to want to experimentate and to discover new propositions, to be surprised. And that's something that really comes along to the audience very easily, not as an imposition.
Has that changed you as an artist?
Sorry?
Has that changed you as an artist?
That made me richer as an artist, for sure. Also, the interacting with the opera house. I came before a couple of times as a guest for guest productions. At Peleas, I remember, lovely production, and a Lohengrin. And then I thought, I can certainly imagine working here on a long-term basis. It's very international, a very international company, the opera, the choir, ballet, very open, very warm. It's very professional and still keeping a human quality.
Have you ever conducted either in Italian or French Verdi's Don Carlo, Don Carlos?
I have always conducted the French version. I'm
Okay.
very fan from the original version in French.
That's fine. The reason I ask is because there are 6 characters in the opera from Flanders. And
Indeed.
Verdi, to me, is maybe the genius. He's certainly one of the great geniuses of opera. He was certainly, I think, the greatest dramatist in opera. And he created these characters who come to the court of Philip II in Spain at the invitation of Carlos, who's the Infante, the son of the king, to plead their cause. And Rodrigo Posa pleads the cause of Fiandra in Italian, Flandre. And Verdi made them all baritones. And it's a fascinating musical moment when they sing Sire, Sire, Sire.
It's quite a lyrical scene. The line is
talk about that scene. And now that you know Flanders, talk about what that means to you additionally that it may not have meant before.
Well, it's funny because both in Lohengrin and in Don Carlos, you have the local spice.
And Elsa von Brabant in Lohengrin.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So in this scene you mentioned, I remember the melody is just so charming. It's one of those cantinellas that you normally would reserve as a composer for a top character, for a top role, because it's just a beautiful, beautiful melody. It keeps on your ear later, and it's only, as you say, sung unisono by these 6 characters, which for us, having this absolutely fantastic choir, we've done it with 6 members of the baritone group of the choir.
Okay.
Sounded fantastic, I have to say.
How do audiences there, and this is for any of you, respond to the way Verdi, through Schiller, depicts the cause of Flanders, which at that time was under the Spanish crown, not under Amsterdam, but under Madrid? Do audiences have a special feeling for that and for those scenes of appealing for Flemish freedom? Because the revolution was 1830, Don Carlo is about 35 years later. Anyone?
I'm looking at Gunther or Daniel because
Gunther.
they haven't spoken yet.
Well, Gunther, we're going to get to for a special episode in the course of our conversation today. Wilfried, what do you think about that? Because you've seen the audiences here for a long time.
Yeah, and I've seen many versions of Don Carlos here in Flanders, the French and the Italian version. I don't believe Verdi was in Flanders very much.
No.
I don't even think he visited it once. I think mostly it's an operatic effect, isn't it, to have the 6 baritones pleading for mercy, and mostly in productions they're on their knees and they're very submissive to Philip II. So that's a shared theatrical effect, of course. It makes Don Carlos in this heroic figure standing up to his father. I don't think there's a. I must say I don't think there's a lot of reaction for that scene. Mostly, you sense a bit of a frisson in the audience, or a sense of recognition in the audience. But it's not that the audience suddenly starts applauding or anything. It's not. I think it's more a theatrical effect than a political message.
Okay. I just want to check also with Johan in Berlin. Did we lose Daniel? Is he there?
I'm still there.
Oh, good. You're very quiet because somehow I don't see you on my screen. Daniel, is anything that I've said so far you want to add to what I've said?
Yeah, it's interesting what you say, but I feel that So in the 19th century, definitely opera, it was very important in building Flemish national identity, and also Belgian national identity was born from an opera, like you said. But I would think nowadays, one of the things that makes Belgium very distinct, what you talked about in the beginning, it is if you are in Brussels, if you are in the train, you will hear 4 or 5 languages in your coupe. You will hear French, German, Dutch, English, and this is one of the things. I'm not from here. I'm from the Netherlands. I lived in various places in Europe, and one of the things I found, especially in Brussels, is that what is distinctive now. It's not that there's a very strong national identity, like, oh look, this is who we are and we are strong. That exists, but what there is also a very strong outward orientation, and people follow what's going on in Germany, what's going on in France, and they're aware of what's happening and integrate all of that. And I find that one of the beautiful things here, which is less tying to a very strong national identity, but more
European.
Yeah, very European in a way. Brussels, of course, is the European capital. It's the prime example of it.
And I now want to go to Gunther with the same question. Did I leave anything out that you want to jump in on in what we've discussed so far? Not what we're about to discuss, which is the main theme of today's program, but I wanted to set the table with a background about Flanders, about Belgium, about this particular opera ballet company before we get into the big topic of today. But Gunther, about everything Belgian and Don Carlo and so forth.
No,
what would you like to add?
No, definitely it's so that we in Belgium, we have no strong identity, like Daniel says, but our creative DNA lies more in the late medieval time, and certainly the Renaissance period. Flanders was an absolutely gem in a trading chain in Europe, and we had connection even with the Middle East, from Constantinople, passing by Venice to Bruges, and then to the north of Europe. And all these influences gave us a lot of DNA, creative DNA. And it was also our trading cities like Bruges, Ghent, Antwerp, of course, were very prosperous. There was a rich economical period, and of course, there were painters, there were musicians. The Flemish polyphonic composers spread out all over Europe, and they came from Flanders. And particularly with the Emperor Charles V, his trumpeters, the trumpeters of Ghent. And now I'm coming to my field of work.
We'll get there.
When Charles V went to the Pope Leo X in Rome, he took with him the trumpeters of Ghent, because they were the most famous trumpeters of his empire. So that gives a little bit an idea how important Flanders was in those days. And we still have a little bit of that DNA for sure. That makes our creativity nowadays. Absolutely.
There's one thing I'd like to ask all of you, but specifically Gunther and Daniel about. I've lived all over Europe. I've traveled extensively in Europe. I've had homes in Italy. I've studied a lot in the UK and in France. And I've been to every European country except Poland. I've even been to Liechtenstein and Moldova and places like that. I've never been to Poland. I will get there. And it's a fascinating, huge culture. It's not a big continent physically, but culturally it's very distinctive with languages and approaches. One thing that I can say about Italy, about Belgium, Flanders, and the southern part, Wallonie, and just a couple of other places, maybe Greece and Portugal to some degree, what the Italians call manualità. In other words, the use of the hands for creation. Certainly the Italians, the Belgians, the Germans particularly, have invented machinery technology of all kinds. The Austrians in their way, the French with a particular love of technology, the British with Industrial Revolution, but that technology was meant to be the extension of the hand, the extension of the brain. In Belgium and in Italy, more than any place else on the continent, I encounter the very strong mind-hand connection. And when I see things that are made in Belgium, they're made very much with the hands. Not that everything is perfect, but everything is individual. And I, who am not necessarily in favor of standardization in all things and prefer individual expression, find it fascinating when I see whether it's a work of art, whether it's a musical instrument, whether it's a piece of chocolate, the individuality that is part of the Belgian expression and the Italian expression. Am I touching on something that resonates for you, Gunther?
Yeah, I have to allow that because of our fight is not the right word, but there was always an influence from outside, and in Flanders people have to work for themselves a little bit, and that gives sometimes own ideas about problems or products or whatever. And you never always go with the flow. You do a little bit with your own. You have to convince yourself about. In this case, with the instrument, it's exactly the same. When you're convinced about a solution, then you go for it, and that's maybe something typical Flemish. I have to agree.
I think there's much less standardization here, and it filters through in many aspects. Where I grew up in the Netherlands, you have a lot of project developers building their neighborhoods, and each house is exactly the same. And pretty much most of the world it's like this. But in Belgium, every house is different. Some are very ugly, some are very pretty, but every house has its own distinct character. And there's less standardization, and people really enjoy to work with their hands. Everybody will renovate their own house. They will not hire a professional, which is sometimes which leads to very interesting results. It's usually not the most efficient way, but it is from an artistic point of view a very interesting approach, and it leads, I think, to very interesting creations. And you see that just if you walk in the streets here, you see it in the architecture, but you also see it in the music. You see it in the instruments that are made here.
Choreography, really everything. And with that, now I'm getting to the main topic of today's conversation. I'm going back to Alejo. You wanted to do Tristan und Isolde, and you did it back in March. Talk about the ideas that you had in creating the production, but very specifically the musical ideas that you wanted to bring that would be Belgian, would be individual, would be handmade, all of the things that you know where I'm going, but I'd rather you talk than I talk.
Right. So in my former Tristans that I had done in the past, in the third act, the call of the ship, the announcement of the ship approaching, is normally played by a trumpet, a regular modern trumpet, which is not quite the Wagner idea. At that very point of the score, Wagner actually describes quite in detail the kind of instrument he's imagining. He mentions a kind of Swiss Alp trumpet in wood, he specifies, that is able to play naturally, meaning without pistons. So you control the sounds just with your lips. So that's why the music is also composed in a way that it would allow a natural instrument on it. And the idea of a wooden trumpet, it was just theoretically, okay, how can we achieve this? I mean, it's hard to build a long, because it has to be, I mean, Gunther will go on the specifics later, but you need a long cylinder for such an instrument in wood, not easy. And I imagine also less brilliant than what you normally would think you need for the announcement of a ship, or the excitement that are Courvenal and Tristan in, just waiting for quite a long time in the third act. But then I thought, okay, let's give it a try. I mean, it remains a possible solution. We don't say it's the definitive, but it's certainly applying all the requirements that Wagner provides us in the score.
Well, Wagner never hesitated to speak and write down every thought that he had. And there are people who are Wagner followers. I am a Wagner follower, who read everything he reads. Some take it as gospel. Some, like myself, take it as the beginning of things to think about, but not always agree with. But wonder why he was interested in what in German would be called a Holztrompete, a wood trumpet. And that already lays out a bunch of ideas. One of my first questions that I will ask to Gunther in a few minutes and to Daniel is what kind of wood, and why the wood and so forth, and whether this is therefore a woodwind instrument or still a brass instrument. But with the announcement of the arrival of the ship, there creates an anticipation. And Alejo, would you please talk about the music itself? If you were to characterize that music in terms of not just the sound, but the emotion in the music.
Well,
talk about
these are pure emotional moments, because Tristan is close to this kind of delirium tremens state, but they both, him and Courvenal, are really waiting, almost delusionary, I would say, for the coming of the ship. And so when finally this sound comes,
and the arrival of Isolde is the important thing.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's what they're waiting. Not the ship; they were waiting for
not the
Isolde.
boats. That wasn't the important. But exactly. Who was carrying it? And when this sound finally comes, it brings out, even Courvenal is reacting, ha. It's like this kind of heroic, typical Wagner exclamations of pure, from the gut excitement. And I think both normal solutions, or either a modern trumpet is wrong because it's like it's reminiscent of this kind of military fanfare kind of color, and also the English horn, which is also applied sometimes as a solution. It's also wrong because the English horn is already used in a completely another different context in the same act with the.
That was my next question for you, was that the cor anglais, the English horn, I associate with different ideas in the third act of Tristan and Isolde, and therefore I'm used to hearing a trumpet
announcing the ship. Yeah,
I'm used to hearing the trumpet for the announcement of the arrival of Isolde, and the English horn for, I call it atmosphere for lack of a better term, but it really, because you hear it but don't see it, and it's very lengthy, the English horn solo.
Indeed.
And it's beautiful, it's gorgeous, and often the person who plays English horn will get a solo bow at the end of the opera, because it's that important. It's kind of like the clarinet in La Clemenza di Tito, that that person is a character as much as anything else. Or the flute player in Die Zauberflöte. There are certain instruments that are soloists practically in an opera. The violin in Thais is another example. And so your desire, Alejo, and solution I'll use a big word, solution, but your desire was to create a new and different sound that perhaps Wagner envisioned. Did Wagner ever create this instrument, or was it just something he wrote down?
No, it remained just as an instruction, but which is funny because I mean there are several attempts in some other fields that they actually produced. I mean the Glocken for Parsifal, the Wagner tubas, the Chalmey for Tannhäuser. But this one remains just as an instruction in the score. And there have been a couple of attempts in modern theaters, not in the times of Wagner, and one of them is ours, thanks to Gunther.
That was my next question. Once you decided that this is what you wanted, how did Gunther become involved in the project?
Yes, for me it was a bit strange. I got a phone call from the first trumpeter last year, early spring in 22. Serge Gaumont is the trumpeter in the Opera House, and he called me if I could talk and discuss a little bit about the special instrument for the Wagner opera Tristan und Isolde. For me, it was quite new because I'm working in the field of the 17th and 18th century trumpets, the pure natural trumpets. But almost immediately, I felt that there was a chance to make an instrument because the quotes Wagner left are very simple. It's a pure natural trumpet, actually. So that's my field of working. That was not a big problem. In this case, what Wagner absolutely wanted was also a wooden pavilion, a wooden trumpet. So for that reason, I had to find another instrument builder to so that we could work together, because I need the experience of somebody who can work also with wood. And for that reason, I came in contact with Daniel Vernooy. And then very, very quickly, we came together, we discussed the project, we made drawings, and then it all started. That's a bit...
So I'm just going to interrupt for one moment, and then we will continue. I know that Alejo has to go in about 5 minutes. Alejo, is there anything else you want to add that I did not touch upon?
Well, perhaps coming to the end of the story, just the surprise and astonishment that the audience had at the sound of it. It was because, of course, we tried to stage it in a way that it's also perceivable visually. So we placed it on a balcony, and most of the people, they couldn't quite recognize what kind of an instrument is that. And that's what actually tells us, okay, then we are on the right track. You know, that you cannot say, oh, it's just a trumpet played naturally or something, or it's a wood instrument. No, it's something in between, and that makes it so unique and so fascinating. Sorry.
So Alejo, I'm going to ask you one last question, unrelated to this, but in a way related. You are in September going to do one of my very favorite operas, Mozart's La Clemenza di Tito,
I'm so glad you say that, Fred.
It includes a clarinet in a very prominent way. And then I'm going to get back to Gunther about clarinets as well.
Yes.
There was someone named Johann Stadler who was a clarinet superstar in 1790, and Mozart heard Stadler and fell in love with the sound and rewrote a lot of his late symphonies and wrote La Clemenza, and he wrote the quintet and the concerto, all for clarinet for Stadler. When you do La Clemenza with the very famous clarinet parts, what kind of clarinet do you want to use when you do this in September?
The one that Mozart requires, which is a clarinetto di bassetto. Not the corno di bassetto, but the clarinetto di bassetto, which is a kind of very rare and unique thing as well.
Right. So therefore, are you going to be in contact with Gunther over this, or do you already have the proper clarinet?
We already have the instrument, yes.
Okay, very good. Then Alejo Pérez, maestro, thank you very much for joining us today. And I'm going to pick up with the other gentlemen.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, Fred.
and keep up the good work. Thank
you.
you. I'm going to go back to Gunther.
Yes.
So, what wood did you select and how did you decide what wood should be selected? And in this, I want Daniel always to jump in. Feel free, Daniel, to join our conversation because you're a big part of this as well.
To jump in, what do you mean? If I should accept the challenge to make the instrument, or
no? I was saying to Daniel that I want him to participate in our conversation, but I know that you accepted the challenge. How did you decide what wood to use to make this trumpet?
That's the field of Daniel, of course. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so for the wood, there were several options that we looked at. The first instrument we constructed, the prototype, we made it in maple. So woodwind instruments, maybe it's interesting to know. Normally, the instruments I make are historical single reed instruments. So I do make basset clarinets, like in for Clemenceau de Tite, there will be a basset clarinet in B flat. Well, normally it's in A. The concerto for Mozart, it's a basset clarinet in A. So, and it's actually this basset clarinet, it's only in this opera. That's the only repertoire that there is for it. There is other repertoire.
So I'm going to ask you, for my listeners, to explain that more. When you say that a clarinet would be in A or in B or whatever key it might be in, what does that mean, and how do you achieve?
Maybe it's nice also to to explain a little bit about the basset clarinet, the instrument that Alejo just mentioned, because it's a wonderful story. The concerto, the famous Mozart clarinet concerto, it was written for a basset clarinet, but for a very long time we did not know what this instrument looked like. None of these instruments survived. There were no images of this instrument, and instrument builders, as they looked at this piece of music, they tried to conceive a clarinet. You need a third lower than a normal clarinet. So you just build an extension. How do you make it? You make it crooked like this. You make it long and then bend it. So there were various ideas, and people made various versions. And then musicologists discovered in a library in Riga an old poster, an announcement for a concert of Anton Stadler, the clarinetist with whom Mozart worked a lot together. And based on this image, and on this poster, there's an image of this basset clarinet. And it's a very strange shape, actually. It's not something that anybody had thought to make, and there were quite a few attempts all through the 20th century. It's long. It's something very interesting. Just Google basset clarinet in A, and you will find it. About the different tonalities of the instrument, clarinets, they were always built instead of. Now we have the B flat clarinet, and you can play in all keys on the B flat clarinet. In the time of Mozart, it was most clarinetists, they had 3 clarinets, one in C, one in B flat, and one in A. And they would switch between these clarinets depending on what key they had to play in. And each instrument also very much had its own color. So the instrument in C, it's the shortest one, and it's a very cheerful kind of clarinet. And you see that the music that requires this clarinet is usually quite cheerful and light music, while the A, it's much more melancholic and much more, has a much more serious tone. And the B flat, it's somewhere in between. Now all these different characters, they sort of fused into the modern clarinet, but of course aspects of that character get lost when this translation is made. But about the wood, for this is single reed instruments. Normally we make them in boxwood, which Buxus sempervirens, which is a hardwood that is native to Europe. It's one of the only real hardwoods that we have in Europe. And before the import of tropical hardwoods, this was mainly used not just for musical instruments, but for all kinds of hardwood uses, machine parts, little jars, combs.
Would you repeat, because I didn't hear it, would you repeat the name of that hardwood that's native to Europe?
It's boxwood.
Boxwood, okay.
Boxwood, yes.
Very good. Now, you mentioned something in passing that I was about to ask you. because not everybody listening plays the clarinet. Talk about what is the reed? Where does the reed go? How does the reed interact with the mouth of the player? And why is there a reed?
These are all very interesting questions. Let me see if I have something. I'm right now in my workshop, so I should have a mouthpiece here.
Okay.
Actually, I have one on my desk. I have here a clarinet I'm working on, but it's not finished. So
okay.
Normally the mouthpiece, I have here a clarinet mouthpiece.
Mm-hmm.
On a modern instrument, you put the reed on, and you have a ligature, a metal fixture that you use to clamp the reed. But historically, in the time of Mozart, you just place the reed. This is the reed. It's from a plant. It's Arundodonax in Latin. It's I think you call it mammoth grass in English. I'm not sure. It's a really big reed plant that grows in the Mediterranean area.
Okay.
And it was used, for example, by the ancient Greeks to make their aulos, their musical instruments. It has a very long musical history, this reed plant. And part of that reed plant, in the past, what they used to do is they used to take the pipe of the reed and they just cut at the top an incision, so one flap can move against the pipe. If you put it on your mouth and you blow on it, you have a very primitive clarinet. And then what instrument makers started to do, they started to make a separate mouthpiece in wood, cut a little bit of the reed and tie that to the mouthpiece. And then if you blow on it, you get a sound.
And then,
I don't know if the sound came through.
It did. And then the fingering is where you would achieve the different notes, in effect, yes?
Yeah. So connected to the mouthpiece, you will turn a piece of wood and you drill some holes in it, and you have a clarinet. I can show some, but I didn't prepare this, so I'm going to see what I will.
That's okay.
Stumble on.
That's okay. I feel like I'm looking into Ruben's studio.
You are, in fact.
Okay. No, but the light is like something out of Vermeer, with the light coming in from the left, and the artist is in the studio. And okay.
So that's an instrument from the time of Mozart. Well, it's not from the time of Mozart. It's a copy I made from an instrument from the time of Mozart. It's the copy of Baumann. Baumann was a maker who worked in Paris.
Yeah.
As you can see, it's the same. It's just a mouthpiece with a reed and then some wood with a few keys to make sure where the fingers can't reach, you can close and open the holes, and no keys in between. So that means for the sharps and the flats, you need to use cross fingerings. And these, they give a very distinctive color to the sound. Which is one of the reasons really that we would play historical instruments. So throughout the 19th century, in the evolution of the clarinet, the instrument gets very much homogenized. Yeah. So each note will sound more or less the same. While in an instrument like this, your A flat, for example, it will sound quite misty and mysterious, while the A and the G, they will be much brighter.
Here.
So passing from an E flat to an A will give the sensation of being in a misty, dark surrounding and being pierced by light. This is the idea. But I'm talking too much about clarinets. I like to, but
the modern clarinets that I've looked at are assembled. The player will take it out of a case and put it together. And is it cork that's in the part in between?
Yeah.
How do you keep the cork from getting dry and breaking?
So at the cork, you can apply wax, but on the historical instruments, we don't use cork. We just use some rope. So we just have some thread. And it's because boxwood, it's a bit less stable than the hardwoods. So as the temperature and humidity changes, it expands and contracts. And then you can remove some of the rope or add some of the rope, depending if the wood moves. With cork, you wouldn't be able to do that.
Part of why I asked, and this is going to sound strange, but it's 100% true. When I was a kid, I was in a youth orchestra, and one of the clarinet players learned from his father. And his father told him never use wax or grease or oil. What the father instructed this Italian-American guy to do was, the side of the nose is oilier than the rest of the body. To take the oil from the side of the nose and rub it on the cork and then put your clarinet together. Have you ever heard of that anywhere else?
I haven't heard it, but now this will be my secret to
I remember
how I grease
watching
the
this
corks.
boy. He was about 10 years old. I remember watching this boy wiping the sides of his nose to put together his clarinet before a performance or a rehearsal. Anyway, Gunther, would you like to join in on the topic of the evolution of these instruments before we get to the specific assignment of creating an instrument for Tristan and Isolde?
Yeah, as a builder of the natural trumpet, of course, we are in the 17th, 18th century, and also there before the industrial period, all these instruments are not perfect. It's the tromba imperfectum. These instruments are playing in the natural tonality. In the natural trumpet, we have 21 harmonics available. You never start with a basic harmonic. It is too low. It's never composed. And the highest parts are, Bach usually goes to the 16th harmonic and only went to the 20th and the Himmel lacht die Erde jubiliert, when the high in the sky, the angels were laughing. Then the trumpets are playing the highest harmonic you can play on a trumpet. But you have to do it with the embouchure. There are no technical keys.
Explain embouchure.
Yeah, it's
a word I grew up with, but not everybody knows it.
Yeah, it's a question of embouchure, and that was so interesting in this case for Wagner. He goes back to that tradition.
Please explain, what is embouchure?
Well, an embouchure is another word is the mouthpiece of the trumpet. I have no mouthpiece available here, but only the mouthpiece we produced for the Tristan trumpet. You can see it, and it's in this case it's made in horn. It's a natural material. It's normally it's also in brass for the trumpet.
Horn from an animal.
Yes, it's buffalo horn.
Buffalo horn, okay.
Buffalo horn, yeah. But okay, for the normal, natural, and a modern trumpet, mouthpieces are produced in brass. Brass is an alloy of copper and zinc. That's
And so here is, for me, the core question since I began thinking about our conversation today. It's called a wood trumpet in German, Holztrompete. Is this a woodwind instrument? Is this a brass instrument? Because we tend to think of trumpets being the brass family. Is it a hybrid of the two? How would you describe it?
Depends what system of instrument classification you follow. But if you would follow the Hornbostel sax, which is the most common way to classify instruments, it would be a brass instrument. But the saxophone, for example, according to this classification, it's a woodwind, though it's not made of wood, but because the mouthpiece is a single reed mouthpiece, you call this a woodwind. And if you use the embouchure, so the way you put your mouth as you would playing a horn or a trumpet, it's called a brass instrument, even if it's entirely made of wood, like an alphorn.
And now, if I'm correct, the saxophone is another Belgian contribution to world culture. It was invented by Adolf Sax in Belgium, correct? And it has
that's correct. It's a beautiful little place where Sax is from. I restored recently an instrument, clarinet, that was made by the father of Adolf Sachs. He was a clarinet maker. And also Adolf Sachs himself, he started out making clarinets. He was the first to put ring keys on the clarinet. And he did a lot in the development of the bass clarinet before he invented the saxophone. The area where he's from, it's an area that is traditionally known for the brass work. So still they do a lot of, they make wonderful pots and plates and lots of things in brass. The area is known for it. But the father, it's an interesting story. The father of Adolf Sachs, he was working for the Dutch court, and that was before 1830. And when Belgium, after the revolution, got independent from the Kingdom of the Netherlands, the Belgian state actually seized a lot of his instruments, and Adolf Sachs had to start again from zero. He didn't inherit because his father was considered to be a traitor working with the Dutch people.
Sure. So before we get into the creation of the actual instrument that was used, I went back and looked at some of Wagner's notes in my okay, pretty good, but not perfect German. And I think that the bottom, let's call it for lack of a more elegant term, of the instrument is sometimes called the bell, is how I would know it. It seemed to me that in Wagner, it was often called a wooden cup. Would you, either of you, Gunther or Daniel, prefer either bell or cup or another word? And also very specifically that the bottom, the cup, the bell, would be wood, but I'm not certain that the whole instrument was meant to be wood. Maybe I'm wrong. What did you get from Wagner's original writings, and what directions did you take based on that?
In terms of terminology, I think Becher of Deutsch, so that you could translate it as beaker as well. This is where cup comes from.
Yeah.
Beaker and
Right,
cup are kind of close, but I think normally for woodwinds you would talk about bell in English.
Yes.
Bell, pavilion,
yeah. Like
pavilion,
in the
bell. Beaker is not an often used word in trumpet descriptions. Bell is okay, or
I like pavilion.
Pavilion.
I do too. So therefore, in reading Wagner's original writing, and then in talking to Alejo Pérez and talking to the Serge, the gentleman who would play this Rigamont, how did both of you, in your different ways and collectively, evolve the instrument that came to be used?
Yeah, okay, that's for me it was quite clear. It was a natural trumpet, and Wagner, of course, he was working in Lucerne on the first act, and he definitely got familiar with the Alphorn sound.
Yes,
that's one of the first triggers. Of course, years later, when he was finishing Tristan und Isolde, he refers to that sound he must have heard in Lucerne. His last act, he was composing the third act in Venice.
Mm-hmm.
In Venice, there are a lot of ships, of course, and trumpeters. When the Dodges and the merchants arrived to their palaces, they were announced with trumpets. So these two parts, for me, it's quite clear that Wagner picked it up, and it created a creative idea around the specific scene where he wanted to have that trumpet. Mm-hmm. And it should be, and that's clear in his remarks, a natural trumpet. But I see his notes more as an open mind brainstorm. He is talking with colleagues of his inner circle, players and builders. Please think about it. I need something in the kind, like a little bit like an Alphorn, and it should only play in the natural tonality, but that's not science. That's for me, it's a brainstorm idea. That doesn't necessarily says that we have to build an Alp horn. Absolutely not. And I'm convinced that in the second half of the 19th century, an ethnical and folk instrument such as an Alp horn could never enter in an aristocratical orchestra environment in Germany. I think that's impossible. For that reason, I quit immediately the idea of making an Alp horn. It should be absolutely a trumpet. But of course,
So, I'm going to interject a couple of things. I'm a big believer that if you want to understand what Verdi, Wagner, and everyone did, you have to go back to Rossini, who was always the person who was the innovator but never got the credit. And he created these sounds in his last opera, Guillaume Tell, using French horns and using other sounds, but somehow the way he composed the music, it sounds like an Alp horn, an Alpenhorn. And to me, it's fascinating. And I've always wondered whether Wagner, who clearly knew Rossini and admired Rossini to some degree, borrowed from Guillaume Tell in creating the horn sounds that he had in different operas, but especially in Tristan and Isolde. Am I onto something with that, or do you disagree? You're allowed to disagree, of course.
Daniel, do you know anything about it? It's not, I don't know.
Okay.
It's not my field. I have no idea about it. Excuse me, Fred.
That's okay.
Daniel can say something about it.
Yeah.
Well, I can also, I'm not familiar with Rossini's use of horns, but I do know that Wagner, he does write in the score of Tristan and Isolde before a bit about horn, because at that point they were introducing valves on horns. So it's 1850s, 1860s. There were still quite a lot of natural horns around, and the horn playing, as it's done in the great concertos of Mozart, where you insert the hand in the pavilion bell beaker cup of the horn in order to play the chromatic scale. This was getting replaced by the valves, and Wagner's comments on this, he says very clearly it's an advantage to have these instruments, but they really lost a lot in terms of the beauty of their tone. And he says this in the preface to the score of Tristan and Isolde. And I think more generally, what you see in Tristan, you have this intense chromaticism in the melody of on English horn just before the Frohe Reise, just before the Holztrompete comes. You have this very chromatic melody, and what the Holztrompete should play, it's completely diatonic. And I don't know who, but can't find the name. But I read it was there is this argument about Wagner that when he writes diatonically, it is as an opposing pole to the chromatic writing, and this is something that is embodied in the natural brass. This contrast between the chromatic and the diatonic, you have it also in the natural brass, the instruments that play the natural harmonics, and the valved or keyed instruments that can play fully chromatic and go in between. And this is one of the arguments, I think, that the argument that the instrument should really be an instrument that plays the natural harmonics, because there's quite some interpretations of different opera companies that have also made this Holztrompete, and Gunther and I intentionally we did not look towards them too much. We studied other instruments, we studied different wooden trumpets, we studied Alp horns, we studied Baroque trumpets. We went to the instrument museum that you mentioned in Brussels, which if anybody is in Brussels, this is a wonderful place to visit. It's one of one of the best collections in the world, I think, of musical instruments here in Brussels. And they are very open for instrument makers and researchers or musicians. If you have an interest in musical instruments, if you are developing something, they are really helpful in letting you study the instruments, letting you measure them, take inspiration from them. So yeah, if anybody is in Brussels, I think it's a good.
I recommend it too, between meals. Because it's a climb up a hill. It's a lot of walking in the museum. So after you've had a good Belgian lunch, then you walk up and you can work off the lunch. It is that and the museum in St. Petersburg, Russia, are two of the greatest musical instrument museums I know anywhere. So now we're getting to the point where you both created the instrument. Talk about the process.
Yeah, the process was, of course, making the drawing, and that was making choices, of course. And the main choice was the length of the trumpet. Of course, it's a combination of brass and wood, that was clear, but the length of the trumpet. And I took immediately the decision to make it on the 8-foot length, as a natural trumpet was built also in the 17th, 18th century. Because then you have available all harmonics, and in each note you are playing, you have the full range of overtones, which gives a very rich tone, and that can come close to an alp horn. An alp horn is in fact, is double as long or triple as long, 16 foot, 32 foot. Wow. The longest, and the longer the instrument is, the richer the overtones and the tonality. That was the first and maybe the most important choice, the length of the trumpet. Then you are playing the signal composed by Wagner sits actually in the middle of the instrument. It starts at the 6th harmonic, and it ends at the 12th harmonic, and that's actually the middle register of the trumpet. You can make a 4-foot trumpet and also play that signal, but then the overtones are very poor. Then you make it's a very small sound, and that would never come close to the real sound of an alp horn. For that reason, I took the decision in full 8-foot length. The problem that existing instruments are not built in an 8-foot length is the way of playing. You need a trumpeter who can master the full natural tonality on an 8-foot trumpet, which is extremely difficult. And that's still, even in Baroque music, there are not so many players who can master the full harmonics on a natural trumpet. For that reason, you have sometimes to accept a compromise. And a compromise for me is in this case 4 foot. I will come back to the notes of Wagner. As I said, for me, it's a bit like a brainstorm, because Wagner, at a certain moment, he is talking about an instrument. He says you should make an instrument with a wooden beaker or a wooden pavilion, at least 3 foot long. He says at least 3 foot long. A natural trumpet in 3 foot can never play the notes he was composing for the signal. So there you feel already that Wagner, he knows, of course, what he wants, but he is not 100% involved, and he had no knowledge 100% about the technical aspects of the instrument. But at least we took the decision to make it in an 8-foot length.
Yeah, the thing is, because of the limited sources that you can draw on, it's actually it's a lot more difficult, because a lot of the decisions of the design, if you just have an historical instrument, you can go to the museum, you measure it, you can copy it exactly, and then all the information is there in the instrument. But if you have a few fragments of texts and a score and an idea of a feeling of what it should sound like, it's a very different process. And I think, especially for me, I think for Gunther, it was a bit more up his alley, because I mean he makes natural trumpets, and I think in terms of design he had better intuition what way to go. But for me, I work with single reed instruments, and it's I don't myself play the trumpet, so there was a lot of freedom actually in the choices we could make for the design, but that doesn't make it easy. That makes it a lot more difficult to produce an instrument. But I think in the end we went through a few prototypes, but I think eventually the instrument we arrived at, I think both of us we felt content to deliver it in this shape to the opera.
Was the musician Serge Rigaumont, who was scheduled to play this music, was he involved in the process as both of you evolved the creation of the wood trumpet?
Yeah, during the process of development and building, we came a few times together discussing the way it was going out. And then as soon there was a prototype, we went to the magnificent workshop of Daniel. And I think four or five trumpeters from the orchestra, they were all there and they tried the instrument. And it was quite surprisingly that for the first tryout, the first prototype, the instrument it worked, it functioned. All the notes were on a good position, and the players, they could master the harmonics. And they were quite convinced and surprised with the tonality, the timbre, the sonority of the instrument. From the first start, we were on a good way of making this instrument.
So Maestro Pérez had to leave us. What did he say about it?
After the tryout in Daniel's workshop, the week after, we went to the opera in Ghent. And there in the opera house on stage, Serge Rigaumont played he gave a demonstration of the signal. And of course, the opera house was empty. There was a good acoustic environment, and the sound was huge, and even till the roof and all corners of the opera house, it was immediately Maestro Pérez was convinced.
So the two theaters in Antwerp and in Ghent are very different in design and character and flavor. Did your instrument sound different in the two theaters?
Absolutely. I could see not the generale, but the general rehearsal.
Yes.
Yeah, that was in Ghent, and then later.
In American English, we say the final dress rehearsal.
Yeah, voila.
Yeah.
And then later on, I could see also the production in Antwerp. Ghent is a smaller theater, and the acoustics is more favorable for, let us say, a smaller orchestra and musical connection. Let us say that's a Mozart theater. Antwerp is, of course, it's wider, it's a bigger room, and the music of Wagner has more breadth and acoustics in that opera house. Also, the trumpet was sounding more clear, and the projection was better in Antwerp than in Ghent, definitely. Okay. Yeah.
How did the audience respond?
I think Alejo already mentioned it a bit earlier.
Yeah, but I want your opinion.
Yeah, the thing is, there is a very strong contrast. So you have this orchestral brooding. I mean, the whole first part of this last act of Act 3, it is there's all this yearning and this sorrow and this despair and this even madness, hallucinations, chaos.
On Tristan's part, Tristan has a long narrative in the third act where he goes through all these emotions and hallucinations, and pictures Isolde, and I saw one production, I'm trying to remember where in effect it was a slideshow. He was there in a chair, and behind him were images of everything he was singing about. They were showing images. Maybe Seattle a long time ago. Yeah, that's where it was.
And the function of the Holztrompete, the sound that it makes is it breaks this spell, and it creates a caesura, a straight cut with everything that came before. So this moment in the opera, whether it's the instrument or whether it's the good performance of the singers and the musicians and the whole way that the opera is set, but this is a moment in the opera that speaks to many people, of course, and I think maybe the instrument contributed to give color to it. Yeah. But of course, there is a reaction at this moment in the opera.
It's definitely. It's definitely.
Yes, Gunther, go ahead. Yes.
It's definitely a magical moment because as soon the signal comes in, the full orchestra is quiet, and then the trumpeter becomes a soloist for I think maximum 2 bars, and then everything explodes again, and there is a thunderstorm, and there is a lot of movement, and then the trumpet sounds a second time, a third time, and it's absolutely it's a key moment in the opera.
It is.
Despite 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Yeah, but that's the remarkable thing that you got to, that I was about to say. All of this work for 90 seconds of music.
Yeah.
I think it's remarkable. I wish I could have been there to hear it. I wanted to tell our listeners that we were scheduled to have a gentleman actually come and play the instrument. He's fine, but he was involved in a car accident on the way to coming to appear with us. He is fine from everything I know. But what we're going to do is post a video on the show page of the instrument being played. But Gunther and Daniel, I don't know which one of you or both of you has a prototype, not the original, because the musician has the original. After all this discussion, let's see it.
So here is the prototype. Hopefully you can see it. It's a mix of brass tubing and then the wooden bell, dus the wooden pavilion. The instrument,
hold it higher, please. There you go. Yes. Yeah.
The instrument, as I mentioned before, is an 8-foot instrument. It's approximately 2.40 meters. The full length of the instrument, but here it has a double loop, which gives here a tuning slide, which was necessary for tuning the instrument. And while the opera was going on, the trumpeter arrives. The piece is already 3.5 hours on going on, and then he had to tune. So for that reason, the tuning slide was very important, and all acoustics, all the notes in a natural trumpet are situated approximately in this area, not in the tubing area. For that reason, it was important to make the wooden bell as long as possible till here. We start here from this all is made in wood, and that's the essential part of the instrument. The cylindrical part in brass doesn't affect too much the timbre and the sonority of the instrument. So the wood functions 100% in this instrument. The choice of wood, that was a decision of Daniel. Maybe you can say something about the choice of wood we used.
Yeah, so the wood, it's maple wood. It's what's used for necks, backs, and sides of violins. Also, big woodwind instruments like bassoons or dulcians were made from maple. It's dimensionally very stable, so it doesn't move. It doesn't move so much. The wood that we used for the final, the last 2 instruments that we built, It was Alpentonholz. It came from the Alps, from Paler. It was fiddleback wood, nicely flamed maple. This was just a prototype. So here you can also see the last section of the pavilion or bell. It's in 2 pieces with some faux ivory ferrule. While in the last 2, it's in 1 piece. So the wood here, it's a bit inferior, but this was something we built to test acoustically whether this was feasible and whether this would work before we would use the really good wood to turn the beaker. Yeah, you can also see, for example, the brass ferrule that's in the middle. It is a cast bell in the originals that I think you will be able to see in the show notes. Yeah.
Okay, in the video.
Yeah.
So last question, unless Gunther, am I leaving something out before I get to my last question?
No.
Okay.
Maybe it's a bit. It's a pity that we can show the final instrument, but okay,
Yeah.
the listeners will see it later on the website. Some photographs, because the aesthetics of the final instrument refers to the South Bavarian Romantic period under the approbation of the King Ludwig II.
Mm-hmm.
And with a very nice ornamentation referring to the castle Neuschwanstein. It is an ornamentation you can find also there in the list room. I took inspiration of ornamentation from that castle. And then the typical 19th century materials a little bit, the ivory rim, then the natural the horn mouthpiece in black, which is an opposite, black and white, a colorful instrument in between, and then the rope and that's a little bit an heraldic element of a natural trumpet, but it's also necessary to combine the brass tubing and the wooden bell. But all pieces are loose. You can fully demount the instrument. Nothing is fixed with soldering, or it's
right.
You can demount the full instrument.
Here's my last question. And by the way, I've loved all of you, including Wilfried. Thank you for making this happen. I loved everything you've all had to teach us today. Yesterday, I completed a month-long interactive course for Adagio about Puccini, who, by the way, died in Brussels, now that I think about that. And yesterday was about Turandot. And by the way, listeners can go to adagio.com and sign up for it. And the course is recorded and you can watch it and still learn about Puccini. One of the things that we dealt with yesterday was the fact that Puccini commissioned gongs that would approximate the Chinese tone and style and scale for the opera Turandot. And the gongs were used at the La Scala premiere in April of 1926. Puccini had died, and then, long story short, got lost in a card game to an American and were brought to the United States. And these were the only gongs that existed that Puccini approved of for the sound that he wanted for his opera Turandot. And the man who won them in a card game cared nothing about music, but found a percussionist who did care about music. And the percussionist was allowed to join different orchestras around the United States and Canada when they were doing Puccini's Turandot to play Puccini's gongs. And that was an added attraction. Other gongs have been manufactured that have approximated these, but there's only one set of the originals, and they're now in New York City, actually. And so I'm wondering, when other opera companies hear about this, let's say in Munich or all around the world, but especially companies with a long Wagner tradition, such as Munich, would Opera Ballet Flanders consider renting their original instrument that you guys have created? Would you guys be open to manufacturing others that would be in the possession of each opera company that does Tristan often? The three of you, Wilfried, Gunther, and Daniel, what are your feelings about that?
I'm convinced that we brought a very pure timbre and sonority into the piece, which is not a standard at this moment. But it's quite new. If they want to pick it up and they believe in the sound of this signal we brought into Tristan and Isolde, I believe the instrument can have a future. But of course, that's very difficult. There is a lot of things that must happen to succeed in that. I know that now Opera Ballet Vlaanderen will lend or give the instrument to other houses when they want to use it. But of course, for us as builders, it would be great if we could get some new commands and possibilities to make new instruments for other opera houses. That's for sure. That would be great.
That's why I asked. I'm putting the word out. I believe in supporting artisans who create things like this. Daniel, your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think it's been a great project, and I really enjoyed making these trumpets, and I would really enjoy making more. So yeah, the final instrument, it's now in possession of Opera Ballet Vlaanderen. So what they do with it, it's up to them, of course. So maybe we have to ask Wilfried about that. But should people want a Holztrompete, certainly Gunther and I can make more. Yeah.
And back to Wilfried, my friend. Number one, thank you for all the help you gave me in putting this program together. From your point of view, the public reaction, the company's reaction to the creation of a new instrument that may have followed Wagner's wishes or not, but nonetheless created something new for an opera that everyone claims to know and love. Tell me your feelings, Wilfried.
Well, first of all, I can reveal that the trumpet will be traveling next year to Rouen. They're reviving this production of Tristan and Isolde, I think, in the spring of 2024. So if there are French listeners or people who want to go to Rouen, they can hear the trumpet in action next spring in 2024. Reflecting on this, I think it's been a whole adventure, and I think it's as you said before, it's only 90 minutes of music, and you put in all this work and all this effort for just that moment.
90 seconds of music.
90 seconds.
Yeah.
I think it's also a job that an opera house like us should do, to invest in that kind of history, in that kind of exploration. It's also a sort of experiment, to do that. I think it's also our job to do that. You can compare it like restoring a painting in a museum or something, that you go and look on how you can bring what Wagner intended as best as possible, and I think we've achieved that. And certainly the audience reaction, because it was in the press before the opening night, of course, and you could see the audience really, when they heard the trumpet, really sit up, trying to find where the trumpet. It was in one of the upper galleries in Ghent and in Antwerp, finding out where that, and you really felt an appreciation that we took this effort. the trumpeter who played, we had different trumpeters who played the instrument. He came to bow at the applause, and every time he got a very, very warm and heartfelt applause, and people really appreciated that we do a very quirky thing like that. Yeah, it's been an adventure, and I also feel very humble when I hear Daniel and Gunther talk about their trade with so much passion. It's a pleasure to hear them talk about it.
We're very indebted to people like both of you, Daniel and Gunther, because what you're doing is what I was speaking of before about this particular dedication you find in Belgium and Italy and a few places to the hands, to creation with the hands, using technology, using tools, of course, but the mind-hand connection is something fascinating, and it creates individual things of great value and meaning that can emotionally move us, that can move forward the discussion about how we create art. And typically we see conductors, we see singers, sometimes we see stage directors, but we don't often see the likes of both of you, who provide such an important ballast underpinning to the performing arts. And therefore, I'm very grateful to all of you for having joined me today on Fred Plotkin on Fridays. I've loved doing this program. I'm glad it happened. And I commend people to go to Rouen. I commend people to always visit Opera Ballet Vlaanderen, Flanders, because it's a great company and you eat very well in Belgium. So there's that too. Thank you all very,
You're
very
also
much.
very welcome, Fred, to join us, and I'll happily take you to lunch.
Oh, good. Okay. I look forward to seeing you all soon and visiting with you gentlemen in person in your workshops and learning more about what you do.
Thank you so much. You're very welcome.
Thank you.